Let's talk about variable in this video. So a variable in C++ and other compile language is basically a storage locations in memory. At runtime, these variables are what we call object in object-oriented programming sense. Each variable has a name and also a type. So the type of variable is the one that dictates how much memory it needs. In computer science, in C++, on a 64-bit computer, for example, an integer uh, data is of 4 bytes in size. String is of 24 bytes. Double is usually about 8 bytes. Sometimes it could be 16 bytes as well. So on and so forth. The way that you declare a variable is to leave a space in between. Actually, if you want to have 4 or 5 spaces in between, it's totally fine. But the way that you declare a variable requires that you have a data type and the name of the variable. So we're talking about the naming convention for the variables. Just note that a decoration, okay, decoration means that you are assigning a memory space to this variable. If this is a memory cloud, and then you simply declaring an integer variable, let's say data. So what you're asking the compiler to do is to carve out 4 bytes of memory space, okay? And said, hey, I'm putting a stake on the ground. This is 4 bytes, and I want to put this information into this 4 bytes integer informations. And this stake on the ground has a name to it, and that's called data. And notice that we're talking about semicolon again. This is the end of a computer statement, right? Code statement that instructs compilers to basically evaluate this. And the evaluation, the compiling relations evaluation, and results in the storage, being carved out in memory. Now, what is interesting about this is variable declaration doesn't specify the value in it, because you're just declaring the variables. You're not assigning a value to it. So it becomes very dangerous in C++ when you have variables left unassigned or uninitialized. Okay, so that is data, and then this is another variable called first underscore name, and that this one has a string type. Okay, so in different languages, there's different spelling. In Java, a string is a class, so you have to use capitalized S. Right? In C++, this string is actually it's a class, but also a primitive as well. So I'll get into the difference between the two later on. But let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so we talked briefly about the syntax, right? The data type. Data types, there's multiple data types in C++. We have string, we have integer, we have double, we have Boolean, we have, right? So we have a lot of these types. And these are primitives that we're talking about here. There could be also data types that we can instantiate, and there will be what we call custom user type that you can declare in C++. We'll talk about that later on. The variable name. You should always choose a meaningful names that I've seen in students' codes where when they devise a solution for something, they like to call these variables that they use in the code X, Y, Z, A, B, and C. These are not very meaningful. In fact, in the industry, you never use X, Y, Z, A, B, C. In fact, there is typically a standard or best practices in which a variable should be named. What you see here, number of students, just one of many ways variables could be declared. And this type of declaration is what we call a camel casing. So it looks like hops, right, on the camel's back, where you have the capital letters. Basically, they're represent a different word, right? So in this case, there's 3 words consolidating to one, and they use camel casing, right? It goes kind of right like this, right? So we have capital and then small letter casing. Sometimes in different companies, people use dashes, and sometimes people use underscore, right? So in this case, you can have num, right, underscore of, right, students. Okay, But anyway, Apple is notorious for asking their developers to write out, basically even the meaning, right, a quick meaning of that variable using a camel case. So sometimes if you look things, if you ever develop code in Objective C, right, you'll see their libraries, like number of students for this class to be used by another, right? They'll have something like that, like really long variable name. But this is all good because whether your variable has only one letter character or 100 letter characters doesn't really matter. The size of your variables is predicated on the type that it is associated with. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. In the next slide, we're going to talk about, going to look at what is a valid naming convention, what is not. You can have a underscore. You can also have camel casing. You cannot have dashes. You cannot have period either. You cannot have a number. You cannot have a number preceding your variable name. You cannot have a symbol preceding and also as a suffix to your variable name. So these are pretty common sense, but if you don't know about it, that's okay. Your IDE is gonna, when compiled, your code is gonna give you an error message. So